to movies by Gurinder Chadha and Suhasini Mani Ratnam. It is a great pleasure for us to have her here. And this is the only academic institute that she is visiting in India during this short trip. She's coming here from the Jaipur Literature Festival, the biggest literature festival in Asia. And may I request Professor Jain to kindly welcome her. Sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for us to invite and to have Professor Chitra here. We are having her visit at a very interesting juncture in this institute. We are discussing right now the new curriculum, and there is a lot of debate how much humanities should be taught and how important is humanities for education of engineers. And there are very strong discussions within the faculty this way or that way. And normally, as a director, you should be neutral and you should let the debate settle, and you should be peacemaker. But in this case, I have chosen to be on one side and not on the other side. And let me just tell you a very quick story, especially because I get an audience of such a size. If I were to address them, they won't come to me. So, please. The story is that India had this engineering colleges, at the time of independence. Roorkee had Thompson College, and Pune had this College of Engineering, and VJTI in Bombay, and there was this Guindy Engineering College in Madras. So there are these 4 or 5 very famous colleges that they were there. And I know for sure about Roorkee, I don't know about others. Roorkee was not giving a degree. They were giving a diploma of being an overseer, and they were giving civil engineer as a certificate. It is like I am in Ahmedabad. They cannot give a degree. They give a postgraduate diploma in management, and everybody treats it to be better than most degrees. So Nehru, after independence, decided that Roorkee should become a university. And government has a tremendous might, and government decided that Thompson College will become a university. And they brought a British engineer to become the first vice chancellor, Dr. Hart. When Roorkee applied to be a member of the Indian Association of Universities, the president of the Indian Association of Universities said, university means universe. And how can an engineering college be a university? And there was a big discussion that you cannot have Roorkee enter into this. But since government has done it, it's a fait accompli. We are willing to accept it, but we are warning, advising, guiding, indicating, requesting government of India not to do such stupid things in future, right? Of course, we continue to do what we like, and we have now so-called technological universities and this universities and that universities. Everybody and anybody now likes to write the word university, but that is not the original definition of university is. So if IIT Gandhinagar has to have the ambition of being a university, I think we must celebrate humanities as much as we celebrate engineering. And it is that in that context that we are extremely excited to have you here, madam. Thank you very much for being with us.
Dr. Jain, for that very warm welcome, and thanks to IIT Gandhinagar for inviting me to come and speak. This is my first talk at an IIT, and I'm very pleased and excited to be with all of you. And I know that, that this is actually a very pleasant and unexpected event. Just a few months back, when US President Obama was visiting India, the New York Times contacted me, and they said that if you had a choice of telling President Obama one thing that he should do while he's in India, what would you ask him to do? And they said, write an article on this. And so at that time, I wrote an article saying that President Obama should come and visit an IIT, because I felt that the quality of education and the quality of students and faculty and just the whole setup of the IIT would be very wonderful for President Obama to see. And now, just by unexpected chance, here I am visiting an IIT, and I'm very happy and excited to do that. It's also a pleasure to have been invited by my once upon a time student, Professor Lahiri, and it's wonderful to see her here. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I became a writer, and then read to you a little bit from my latest book, which is my 16th book. It's a novel titled One Amazing Thing. So when I stand in front of an audience to talk about my writing, I'm always surprised in some ways, amazed that that's what I'm doing, because all of my years when I was growing up in India, and in fact several years after I went abroad to do my graduate studies in the United States, I never thought I would become a writer. It was only after I'd finished all of my formal education and I'd received my PhD from Berkeley and actually started teaching at the university, and I was teaching literature. That was when I started to write. And so sometimes I think back on what it is that made me into a writer. I think it was a combination of various things. But one of them was that it was actually a tragedy in my life that made me want to write. And what happened was that my grandfather, whom I'd been very close to while I was in India, passed away while I was going to school at Berkeley. And I was almost finishing up. I couldn't afford to come back for his funeral, but that made me very sad because he had been very close to me. He had been one of the first storytellers in my life. When I was little, I would go and spend, as I'm sure many of you do, I'd go and spend vacations with him. And he would tell me these wonderful stories out of the Bengal folk tales. I come from Bengal, so he would tell me the stories of the folk tales of Bengal, and he would tell me stories out of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and all of these wonderful fairy tales. And I think somewhere that left an impression on me. So a few days after his funeral, I was in Berkeley and I was lying in bed and I was thinking about my grandfather. And I closed my eyes and I tried to imagine his face, the way we do with the people we love. And I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't visualize his face. And I was really shocked because I realized something. I realized that he was this person who meant a lot to me, and I was forgetting him. As I was getting more and more busy and more involved with my everyday life in the United States, I was forgetting important things about India, about people and places and my experiences growing up. I was forgetting how people thought and spoke and behaved, and I didn't want to lose it. I knew that that was a big part of who I was. And so I thought I'll start writing about it, because if I write about it, then at least it'll be an action against forgetting. As we write things, we preserve them. And so I started writing really very, very much just for myself. I was a closet writer for many years. And actually, I wasn't any sure that the little stories and poems that I was writing, or the little memory recollections I was writing, would be of interest to anyone. And I didn't know if they were any good. In fact, I was worried that they weren't very good. But since I was writing for myself, that was okay. Now, what I did realize after some years when I went back and looked at my work is that actually my early work was very bad. And this is true, I'm not making this up. But I like to share this because sometimes people think that if you see a successful writer, they must have been very good at writing right from day one. But I like to remind students that in my case, at least, that was not so. But what was true is that, and this is what I tell my students too, if one is really passionate about writing and communicating, and you keep working at it, and maybe you take some courses, or you join a writer's group and you get some good feedback, and you revise and you revise and you make things better, then you do become a better writer. And that was certainly true in my case. So I went through a period of being a bad writer, and then I did join a writer's group, and I started getting feedback on my work and changing it, making it better. And then I started publishing, and so in that way, I became a writer. And what were some of the things I was writing about? I was, of course, writing about India. A number of my books, such as the novel Sister of My Heart, is set in my native town of Calcutta, my native city of Kolkata. And it's Sister of My Heart is set in a very traditional Bengali family where these two girls who are cousins grow up. And it's about their many adventures as they're growing up and as they get married, and one of them comes to the United States. So the other subject that I often explore is that of immigration. Because in my life particularly, and I think by talking to many people in our Indian American community over there, I realized this, that I'm not alone, that immigration was it was an important and transformative moment for many of us. For me, certainly, I came from a very sheltered family, a very traditional family. I had known mostly Bengali people around me before I went to the United States. And I was thrust into a world that was very different. And I was forced to do things I had never done before. Away from the sheltering influence of family, I had to really stand on my own feet. I had to learn to interact with and try and understand people of very different backgrounds and different cultures who themselves had ideas about who Indians were and how Indians should be treated. And all of that was a great learning experience for me. It opened up my world, and paradoxically, and maybe this is true if any of you have lived abroad away from your home culture, or even if you moved from one part of India to another, as many of you I'm sure have, even to come to IIT here. When I lived in Kolkata, and I was surrounded by my culture, I didn't really understand it very well. And partly that is because I didn't ever think about it. I just took it for granted. It was all around me, kind of like the air we breathe. And in some ways, it was only after I went halfway across the world that I began to think about what my culture meant to me, who I was, and even to evaluate what parts of my culture did I value and which parts did I question. And so all of that comes out in books like my collections of short stories, Arranged Marriage and Unknown Eras of Our Lives, which really talk about the lives of immigrants, how immigration changes us, what are the things we gain, and what are the things we lose, how our relationships with people become transformed, become complicated, our relationships as we go with our parents back home, if we're married with our partners, if we have children with the children, and ultimately ourselves, because our notion of who we are in the world shifts a little bit when we move into a very different culture. So these were some of the things I was writing about. And then, as Professor Lahiri mentioned, I started working with women's groups. I started working with groups that helped women in domestic violence situations or other situations of abuse. And that had a very profound experience. That was a very profound experience. It left a deep mark on me as I worked with these women who came from sometimes very, very terrible situations, things that we wouldn't think of. And they were women that if they hadn't come to me and told me this was going on in their lives, I would never have guessed it, because many cases of domestic violence occur in the privacy of the home. One never even sees it. People have all kinds of ideas about domestic violence. I did too, which are not accurate. We think that maybe these things happen in lower economic circles of society. These things happen among uneducated people, and so forth. Or these things happen in some other community. Like in India, we have many communities, and we like to think that all the bad things happen in communities that are not ours. But as I began working with domestic violence, I realized that all of it was really not true. Unfortunately, domestic violence is something that crosses race borders, geography borders, economic borders, and it's very pervasive. And I think there was one experience that really shook me up and made me feel that I had to do something about it. And this was when I was living in the San Francisco area. I was volunteering for an organization called the Support Network. And it was a mainstream organization. It was run by white people, black people, and mostly people of white and black races came there. And then I had never seen any Indians. And this was right in the beginning, so I thought, well, maybe, that means there aren't many Indian women in this situation. But one day, I still remember very clearly, it was a Friday, and one of the people at this support network office called me and they said, please come in, there's a South Asian woman here, and can you come and talk to her because she doesn't speak much English. So I went in, There's this beautiful young woman, and she had a little baby in a car seat with her. And as soon as she saw me, she said, she spoke to me in Hindi, and she said, please tell these people to let me go back home, because I think I made a big mistake in coming here. And my husband's at work now. I have to get back home before he comes back, because if he found out that I came here, he'll be very angry with me. So I said, okay, yes, we're not going to hold you here against your will, but tell us what the problem is. And then she started talking. And then in the course of her conversation, she raised her shirt and showed me her back. And it was completely lacerated, like someone had just cut across it. And we were so shocked, just to see something like that. And we said to her, your life is obviously in danger. You can't go back to this situation. And she kept crying, and she said, no, I have to, because I'll bring a lot of shame to my family if I don't. And also, I don't know how to make a living. How will I bring up this child? This child will suffer if I stay away. So anyway, we talked to her and we said, there are ways we can train you, we can get you a lawyer. What is happening to you is just not right. And so we managed to persuade her to go to the shelter. We had a shelter which was in a confidential location. And we told her, you go to the shelter. This was a Friday. We said, at least think about it over the weekend. And then on Monday, we can revisit the issue and we can talk about how to help you. So she went, and I gave her my number, because it was one of those centers where you can call out, but because it was a confidential location, you can't phone in. Someone else couldn't phone in. So I said, just call me if you need anything, if you need to talk to someone over the weekend. And she did call over the weekend, but she didn't call me. She called her husband, and he came and took her. And we never heard from her, ever, after that. And because she had been too afraid to give us her name, we couldn't follow up. She hadn't given a name, she hadn't given an address. We couldn't do anything about it. We never knew what happened to her. We never saw her, we never heard from her again. But obviously I remembered that for years and years. I still wonder what happened to her. But she had a profound influence on me beyond even that, because of a couple of things she said before she went. She got into the car that would take her to the shelter. And she said something that really changed me as a person and as a writer. She looked back at me and she said, who really cares? Who in this country really cares what happens to me? Who even knows who I am? And later, when I would think about her, I thought about those words. And I thought, she's right. And she felt so desperate that she had to go back to her husband, because she felt there wasn't anybody who cared enough to stand by her. And they didn't care because they didn't know her story. And it struck me that it's so important for us to tell these stories. Tell the stories of ourselves and our people and of the important things that happen, and to read those stories. Professor Jain was talking about the importance of humanities and literature. Literature is something that humanizes us as we read each other's stories, and we find out these secret tragedies that occur beneath the surface that might seem very ordinary. We learn compassion, we learn how to deal with people, we learn how to relate, we learn how to create a community out of strangers. And so after this, I decided that that's the kind of book I want to write. Those are the kinds of stories I want to write. So I did a lot of writing about women's issues and putting women in the centers of my stories, and about the immigrant community, looking at what are some of the challenges of the communities, what are some of the problems people are facing with intergenerational conflicts, with situations where children feel so disempowered that they join gangs. We often hear a lot of things about how well our immigrant community is doing, and that too is true. But beneath the surface, there's a lot of other things that are going on. And I felt that it was important to tell those stories as well. So a number of my other books deal with that. A novel like Queen of Dreams, for example, combines different things, because I like to combine different kinds of worlds that are part of our Indian culture and heritage. So in a number of my books, such as Queen of Dreams or Mistress of Spices, there's an element of the magical, the supernatural, of people with special powers. So Mistress of Spices, which as some of you know, was made into a movie with Aishwarya Rai in the main role. And if you don't, I think it's now available on YouTube, so you can go check it out. But so in that, the main character, Tilo, lives in an Indian grocery in the United States, and she has this special power that if you walk into that store, she can look at you and she'll know exactly what you need to be happy. And she'll give you a spice with a special power to make you achieve whatever it is that you wanted to achieve. So through the vehicle of the grocery, then I have many kinds of people come to Tilo with their different problems. So, and then Tilo gets involved in their lives and tries to solve their problems and is able to help with some, but perhaps some of them, the results are not quite what she expects. And all of those complications make up the story. Queen of Dreams is set after as that novel is going along, 9/11 occurs. And so one of the themes of the novel is how did 9/11 impact our communities in the United States? While all of us were shocked at what had happened and all of us were mourning for people who had died for no fault of their own, there was also a wave of fear and hatred going across the country, targeted at people who looked dangerous. And a lot of times people of our community were targeted. And so 9/11 and its impact is one of the themes of Queen of Dreams. Well, but I like to, as a writer, it's important for me to try different things each time. So I'll tell you really quickly about my latest novel, and then I'll read you a little bit from it. Then ideas come to me, people ask me sometimes, where do you get the ideas from your novel? Ideas come to me from different places. For example, one of my novels, The Palace of Illusions, is the story of the Mahabharata, but it's told from Draupadi's point of view, so she is the narrator. I think that idea must have been in the back of my head from the time when I was a child and my grandfather would tell these stories. And I would wonder, oh, well, we hear so much about the wars and we hear about all the heroes, but what are the women thinking as all of this is going on? And so Palace of Illusions is a response to that. But my latest novel, One Amazing Thing, came to me on a day when I certainly didn't expect that I would get an idea for a novel. In fact, the idea of writing a novel was very far from my mind, because this was a day which was quite dangerous. I live in Houston, in Texas, and every once in a while we get these hurricanes. And on this day, a very big hurricane was coming right at Houston. It's called Hurricane Rita. Some of you might know about it. And just a few months before that, there had been another huge hurricane, Katrina. And as I'm sure some of you know, Katrina devastated New Orleans. It was just terrible. And many of those refugees came to Houston. So we saw what a hurricane can do. And now Rita was coming right at us. So the authorities evacuated all of Houston. Now, Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States. And if you evacuate, you can just imagine, evacuate the whole city, what happens? Nobody is able to go anywhere because the freeways are completely impacted. All right, so we left home in the evening, and around 3 a.m., we had only managed to go about maybe 20 miles outside of Houston, and we were stuck on the freeway. A hurricane was getting closer, and people were starting to panic. And people were starting to behave really badly, and, the car engines had overheated, and tempers had also overheated. People had gotten out of their cars, and they're getting into arguments, and just behaving out of fear and panic, turning on each other because that's all there was to do. And I was just watching all this, and then I noticed that, however, some people, it was like the situation had brought out the best in them. And they were going around trying to calm people down, and if there were older people in the car, they'd offer water. People with children, they were trying to help them. And so the writer part of me started thinking, what is it that in a catastrophe makes some people behave so badly and some people behave so much better? What is it that brings out the worst in some people and the best in some people? And is there some way in which we can learn to deal with catastrophe so that we can behave in that more graceful, positive manner? And out of that thinking, one amazing thing came several years later. And because I'm a fiction writer, there is a catastrophe in that story, but it's not a hurricane. And I'm going to read to you that part, so I won't tell you what it is. But this novel is about a group of strangers who go to an Indian visa office in the United States. And while they're waiting there, this catastrophe occurs. And they can't get out, the situation is very dangerous, and they have to figure out how to deal with it. And how, out of that group of strangers, people of different races and ages and socioeconomic backgrounds, people who, if you saw them on the street, you wouldn't even talk to, ever. Sometimes you'd cross over to the other side of the pavement because we don't, generally when we have the choice, often we don't want to associate with people who are different from us, even though we're living in a more increasingly multicultural and global community. So one amazing thing poses that question, how can a group of strangers be turned into a community? Is it possible? And I'll read you a little bit from the beginning of the book. With each book, I try to set myself a new challenge. As a writer, that's important for me. So before this, all of my books had one hero, or maybe in a novel like Sister of My Heart, two narrators, two people are telling the story, and they have alternate chapters. But since this was a novel about building community, I really didn't want a single hero or heroine in it. So this book has 9 characters, and each of them in turn become the narrators of the story. And so that was something different for me. And that was quite challenging because not all those characters are Indian, not all of those characters are from a background that I would know just by living my life, so I had to do a lot of research. But I'm going to read to you a part which is in the consciousness of Uma, who is a graduate student. And she lives in California, but she's gone to the visa office to get a visa to come and visit India because her parents, who used to live in the US, have moved back. Now they've resettled back in India. And as you know, that is a phenomenon that is often happening nowadays. And she has decided, she has a boyfriend, his name is Ramon. And she hasn't told her boyfriend that she's coming to the visa office for reasons that will become clearer later on. But now she's been waiting all day in the visa office and she says, well, maybe I should call Ramon. But she can't get a signal, a mobile signal, so she's walking around trying to get that. Phone to her ear, Uma took a few steps forward. It felt good to stretch her legs. The phone gave a small burp against her ear, but before she could check if it was working, a rumble rose through the floor. It was as though a giant had placed his mouth against the building's foundation and roared. The floor buckled, throwing Uma to the ground. The giant took the building in both his hands and shook it. A chair flew across the room toward Uma. She raised her left arm to shield herself. The chair crashed into her wrist, and a pain worse than anything she had known surged through her arm. People were screaming. Feet ran by her, then ran back again. She tried to wedge herself beneath one of the chairs, as she had been taught long ago in grade school, but only her head and shoulders would fit. The cell phone was still in her other hand, pressed against her ear. Was that Ramon's voice asking her to leave a message? Or was it just her need to hear him? Above her, the ceiling collapsed in an explosion of plaster. Beams broke apart with the sound of gigantic bones snapping. A light fixture shattered. For a moment before the electricity failed, she saw the glowing filaments of the naked bulb. Rubble fell through the blackness, burying her legs. Her arm was on fire. She cradled it against her chest. A useless gesture, and she would probably die in the next minutes. Was that the sound of running water? Was the basement they were in flooding? She thought she heard a beep, the machine ready to record her voice. "Ramon," she cried, her mouth full of dust. She thought of his long, meticulous fingers, how they could fix anything she broke. She thought of the small red moles on his chest. She wanted to say something important and consoling, something for him to remember her by, but she could think of nothing, and then her phone went dead. And so, as you figured out, a major earthquake has hit, and it is really a severe catastrophe. They're completely cut off from the world. No electricity, no telephones, and she is right, a pipe has broken somewhere, the water is rising, things will get worse, and people start panicking. And just as that night when we were trying to escape from Hurricane Rita, in their fear, people begin to turn on each other. And things are really like disintegrating fast. And then finally, Uma says to them, we're just destroying each other. We can't get out, we figured that much out, so we've got to occupy ourselves with something positive. So why don't we each tell each other a story out of our lives, something we've never told anyone. And that way we'll pass the time and we'll get to know a little bit about each other. And everybody thinks this is a terrible idea because they're like, we're dying and you want us to tell a story? Besides, we don't have any stories to tell. And then Uma says, no, that part I don't believe because everyone has at least one story. In each life there is at least one amazing thing that becomes the title. And so slowly they begin telling these stories. And as they begin telling these stories and really sharing with people in that room something they've never told anyone, and now they're totally honest, right? Because they think that maybe they only have a few hours left, maybe these are the only people they're ever going to see before they die. So they really start telling some intense stories. And as they do that, just the sharing of the story becomes something that draws them close. So that in the beginning of the book, they are, just like we were as we were trying to get out of Houston, we were like, we want to survive, we don't care what happens to you. That's how they were in the beginning. But by the end, they begin caring about each other. So they don't want to survive at the cost of the other person. They want to survive all together. And that's kind of the framework of one amazing thing. And as I was telling you, the challenge there was to write some different characters because I really wanted to push things to the limit. I wanted to bring in people of different races and backgrounds. So one of them is African American. He's an older guy, he was in the army. One of them is a young Muslim man. There's a white couple. There's a Chinese grandmother with her granddaughter. And there are some other people, the visa office workers. So the stories they choose to tell and what happens to them, that's one amazing thing. All right, I think you want to do some questions. So I finished my talk, and now it's your turn to talk to me. Okay, let me just say something. I want some easy questions to which I'll be able to provide brilliant answers. Okay, I saw a hand over there.
Ma'am, you have written many books. So
Do we have another mic here?
okay, I can.
Or I'll pass them.
Okay, you take the mic, I can...
Yes. Name and then.
My name is Manish Kumar. I'm just PhD student here. Ma'am, you have written many books. So during that journey, can you share that moment when you like this? Okay, I did it. Now I can write. I can really become writer, and I can change the different genre. I can write in this mode. It's that moment I achieved.
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you. Thank you. So, Yes, in the beginning, for a long time, I was writing, as I told you, I was just writing for myself. I didn't have much confidence. Even when I started publishing in magazines, I would feel, oh, okay, maybe I'm not that good. They published it, but maybe, they weren't really looking carefully, otherwise they wouldn't have published my story. So, but I think after my first collection, Arranged Marriage, came out, and it received a big award, the American Book Award, I think that gave me a lot of confidence. And I began to feel that, yes, these stories, there's something to them that speaks to other people. Because although they were stories very much about the Indian community in the United States, it is my belief that there's something universal and human about literature. That's why we connect to stories from many different countries and of many different times. And I think that was the moment when I said, I think I can be a writer. Yes, this is what I want to do. I really want to do this for the rest of my life. And I still feel that way. Being a writer is very exciting. The challenges are always different. There's always a level of surprise. When I sit down to write a story, I know a little bit of what I'm going to write about, but I don't know the whole story. I don't know how things are going to end, but I trust that my imagination will uncover it at the right time. And so I sit down and I write the next part of the story, and then the next, and then the next. And it's like, one writer said it very nicely, it's like driving through the fog at night with your headlights on. You see a little bit, you don't see the whole way, but you see enough to keep going. Another question?
I'm very happy to be here. I just drifted in the audience. I came to meet the director, but I was invited to this. So I'm very happy.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
But I have two questions. One is that the art of reading or the art of writing, is it not decaying in the years to come? The visual experience is gaining much more ground. What you experience, if it is presented in a visual experience, it's much more effective, much more powerful. That is one. Second is, it just flashed to me, you said that the people came out of the best and the worst in those circumstances, which you talked about in Houston. Isn't it that the politicians world over are understanding those human outputs as an experimentalist, as scientists do? That given a circumstance, the output would be, the human would react to a situation, like say 9/11. The world has unified against a particular force. Or any situation which happens in the world, any situation which we occur day to day, the politicians are the best psychologists. They understand this is a situation that people will react. And whoever understands this, and you people create a fantasy, and politicians probably take a cue from you. Is it like that?
Those are two complex questions. I'll start with the first one. Do I feel that in this world now reading and writing is becoming less, and maybe the other experiences, the visual experience or the internet and all of those things are becoming more, movies? I just, as a writer, of course, I wonder these things sometimes. But I just came back from the Jaipur Literary Festival, and there were almost 50,000 people, book lovers, who were there just going to listen. They'd come from so many places to listen to writers and to buy books. So I was greatly heartened that, the book is doing well. And of course, I think it depends a lot upon this generation, all of you. Is the book going to survive? Is the book going to go well? A lot of it depends on whether you pick up those books and you find something of value in them. Books are obviously, they are some of the most amazing artifacts, if we can call them artifacts. Through books, think of all the things that we can do. Things that are different from what we can do by watching a movie, even a good movie. Because when we read a book, the movie has to be created in our head. So we are using our powers of the imagination, our power to envision things in a way that's far more far more strong. And we're using that capacity in us, which if we don't use, will slowly dwindle away. And it is that power to be a visionary and to imagine things that will lead you to succeed in all of these other wonderful areas that you're training in. So I think the book and the reading of the book is a very important experience, but fortunately I think many other people also believe that, and as I said, going to Jaipur really made me feel happy that the book is alive and well. But, I guess my message or my appeal to all of you young people is, don't forget the book, because the experience you get from the book is just amazing. It's just nothing else can, if you love reading, you know this, that what you get from reading you can't get from anything else. And the other wonderful thing about reading is, if you love reading, you will never be bored. You will never be alone. You will be with some of the greatest minds of the universe. And who would not want that? Who wouldn't want those people to be their companions? The other question is even more complex. So I think what I would say is that, yes, not only politicians, but I think many people look at what's going on in the universe. And again, they look at books which have taken those situations and dramatized them. And they learn a lot about human behavior. I think that's all of us. I have learned so much about human behavior in times of catastrophe, but also in other dramatic times or tragic times by reading books. And the thing is that once we learn it, we don't want to exploit it. We want to use it to help other people. So hopefully the politicians will do that. That's the last little bit which has to fall into place.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, suppose you have a story into words. So, what kind of things you need to do? When is the time you'll decide, okay, now I'm ready to put everything which I have in my mind into words?
You yourself all the time. And not only that, I have this idea, it's a great idea, but it's a complicated and difficult idea. How will I put it down, right? What if I mess it up when I'm starting to write it? But the answer is that you have to, like they say in that slogan, just do it. You just have to get down, you just have to sit down and you have to just write it. And it's okay. I think the art of writing is a wonderful and forgiving art, much easier than, let's say, if you were painting a picture, because if you paint and you make a mess of it, you just have to throw that canvas away. But if you're writing and you make a mess of it, you can just revise it and you can make it better. So, and nobody ever has to know how bad your first draft was. So I think a lot of what it is about writing is you just have to believe in yourself. I have a good story, I really want to tell it, and I'm going to do my best. And if it's not really good the first time, that's okay. I'll revise it and I'll make it better. You just have to get down there and write that story.
Hello, ma'am. May I ask you a question, ma'am?
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, the thing is that I have written a small paragraph. I would like to read in front of you as well as these audience also. Whenever I am talking about or thinking about diasporic writing or diaspora community, I end up with one question. And that question will be, I will tell you after reading this small paragraph. May I?
Okay.
The title story, The Unknown Errors, this is a paragraph from my dissertation. I have my dissertation degree on Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's The Unknown Errors of Our Lives. The title story, The Unknown Errors of Our Lives, depicts the cultural clash that the diasporic is compelled to face on his adopted land. Mother culture works at an unconscious level. Adopted cultural habits remain superfluous and momentary. All the pleasures and luxuries related to the adopted way of life gets dim when they confront the home culture. The mixture of cultures, home and adopted, torture the adopter psychologically. One's own way of life is simple and normal. To him, the other is different. One is culturally perfect and believes firmly that the other is not the way I am. One is reasonable himself and the other extremist. Despite the feelings for otherness, either on one's own side or on the opposite side, the diasporic people search for self-identity on the other land. Many have proved themselves successful, but only after paying a high price. ethnicity has a tight bondage with oneself. It can never be discarded, just as the complexion of the skin. Howsoever modernized they may be, the diasporics try their level best to connect to their ethnic identity. And in case they fail to do so, they feel decentered with identity lost. Ma'am, this is my observation of diasporic writing, and this is my feel towards diaspora community. And my question is that does diaspora end up with a compromise?
Well, that's good. I liked what you wrote about the complexity, the confusion, the battle that goes on once we've left our homeland and we've come to another culture, and then those cultures.
This is what I have found in your stories, ma'am. This is just.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Now I have to, of course, give a little preface, which is that, writers like to write about dramatic and tragic things. If you remember Tolstoy, in the beginning of the novel Anna Karenina, he makes a remark. He says, happy families are all alike. It's only the unhappy families that each have their own story. So basically what he's saying is that, happy circumstances, there's not much you can write about them. It's only in tragedy that the depths of the human being is plumbed, and the best of a human being comes out in those difficult situations. So in my stories, as in Tolstoy, as in Tagore, as in many great writers who have inspired me, we choose those moments of conflict, right? Now, so that is not to say that there aren't many hundreds of diasporic people who are perfectly happy where they are, who don't experience even 1 minute of conflict. They're they've decided, I'm here, this is good, right? So we have to remember. But generally, literature isn't written about those people. Sometimes people ask me, why are your stories so sad? Is everybody's life sad like that? So I said, no, that's just my imagination. It's just attracted to those sad things.
There was a classroom conversation when my MPhil studies were going on, and I told my teacher that I'm never going to be there.
No. You always have to remember that literature will portray that dramatic part, and ads will portray the other part.
I loved your analogy about the fog and finding your way around in the fog. So this comment is kind of quite the opposite of what you are saying. When you write, do you ever feel that it's all been done before?
That is a good question. Do I ever feel like it's all been done before? You mean by another writer?
Yes.
Well,
this is what I feel when I write something. I feel, okay, I've read this, I've done been there and done it kind of feeling.
Yeah, well, that's why it's important to, if you want to be a writer, you've got to be a reader so that you know what's out there. It's just like any of the sciences or the industry. You got to know your competition, right? And then you can see what's being done before, and then you'll say, no, okay, I'm interested in the same thing, but I'm going to come at it from a different angle. And then you decide, what will bring out the originality of your vision? But that's why I think if we read a lot, then we kind of know what's out there. But it's quite amazing that if we think deeply, it's amazing how much original substance we can come up with. Because I think we have these great depths inside of us. And if we learn how to go deep into them, all kinds of amazing things do come out. I mean, I'm often surprised. People ask me, well, where do you get ideas for stories? Or sometimes, like with One Amazing Thing, there's a particular incident. But sometimes at the most random moments, a great story idea will just come to me. I mean, it's like a gift from the universe. And I'm always thankful. Maybe I'm like exercising and I get an idea. Or I'm cooking and I'll get an idea. Or I'm driving. I'll get an idea, and that's kind of dangerous because otherwise I can stop and jot it down, but when I'm driving, But so I don't think we should worry about not being original, not being able to be original. If we think that this has been done before, we just have to revisit the idea and be quiet. A lot of artists meditate, including myself. I find that meditation is a great thing to do, no matter what. Right? It allows us to reach levels in ourselves that we otherwise can't. But for artists, it's very good because it allows you, in that silence, to bring up many things from levels that we can't otherwise really reach as human beings.
My name is Arup. I read in one of Graham Greene's autobiographical works, he says there's a splinter of ice in every writer's heart. I think what he wants to suggest is the writer is dispassionate to the extent you can call him unfeeling. But do you find that you've had to do this when you're writing about these tragic events? You need to observe them very dispassionately, right, to collect the facts. But to present them, you need to be very compassionate.
Right.
How difficult or easy do you find that?
That's a very interesting comment because I think you do. And that's why you have to, it's like you have to do different things at different points in writing. For example, when that incident that I told you about happened with that young woman, obviously it left a great mark on me, and I wanted to write about women in situations like that who were desperate, right? But in order to write about that, I had to distance myself. Because otherwise, if my emotions were all up and down, I wouldn't be able to write a very good sentence. I mean, we know this. When we're really upset, if we want to talk to someone and express how upset we are, we can't even do that. We can't even express in words what we're feeling. We certainly can't express in writing what we're feeling. So after feeling, but the feeling deeply, just like you said, is very important because otherwise how do we learn compassion? So we feel deeply, and then the artist has to come up and say, now I have to shape this into art. So now I have to put the feelings aside and think of this as something I'm creating, and how can I create it best? And then the effect that the artist wants, of course, is that original effect, that the reader reading it will feel that passion, or will feel that sorrow, and will feel ultimately that compassion. So you gave an interesting quote out of Graham Greene. I'll give you one of my favorite quotes out of Kafka. And Kafka says, and I'm kind of generally quoting, so some of the words may not be exact. He says, "A book should be like an axe to shatter the frozen sea that is inside us." So, all right, so maybe we have to have a splinter of ice in ourselves as we are writing the book, but when the book is written, it should be the axe that shatters the frozen sea in us. It should arouse that much compassion in us, and that's the book I want to write.
Just a connected question, I thought I'll jump in because how painful it is to write a story, because you have to go under the skin of the character. And if the character is going through the pain, physiologically, do you feel the pain?
The question is, if the character is suffering and you're writing a story about that character, how do you feel? Do you feel that? Yes, you do. When I write my characters, I have to intensely imagine them. I have to really put myself in that place, and I have to just feel everything that character might be feeling and think everything I think that character is thinking in their heads, and feel all of their frustration, perhaps all of their fear, all of those things. It is very difficult. Sometimes after I write an intense scene, I find that I'm really kind of shaken up, and I have to go for a walk or something to clear my head. I have to do something like that. So yeah, it is. Sometimes, I do find myself getting very emotional if I'm writing an emotional scene. I remember when I was writing Palace of Illusions, and I was writing the scene when Draupadi is being disrobed in court, and she's crying out to everyone to help her. I remember I was getting really very upset by that whole thing, because I was just imagining how it must have been for her, who had been in such a position of power and had so much respect, and now she's dragged into the court, and even though her husbands are sitting there, no one will help her. So yes, absolutely. I think we have to experience that. If I don't experience it when I'm writing it, how will you experience it when you read it?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Mid-80s, when I was a student of English literature, we grew up sort of in the company of all Lawrence and Dickens and Hardy and Graham Greene mentioned. We found a different kind of a narrative style which evolved, and we grew up learning that. Now, as a teacher, when I'm supposed to teach narratology and writing theory, I'm at times
all those people that you grew up with studying and the very contemporary writers who are writing. And that is a complex question because there are many differences and many similarities. On a human level, I think on the feeling level, we feel a lot of the same things. But I think the modern narrative is much more fragmented. Okay? The older narrative, someone like Dickens, comes out of a very clear idea of a world in which this is good, this is bad, and the character goes through these experiences. We know exactly what the character is going through. If you've read David Copperfield, we go through his life, we learn along with him, and the narrator is basically, the hero is a good character. He makes mistakes, but he's a good character, and we're sympathetic with him. So things are clear-cut. This is good, this is bad, this is the way to behave, this is what happens when you behave otherwise. There is a moral universe that makes logical sense in much of that older world. I think after the Second World War particularly, in art as well as in literature, people lost that certainty. Who was the enemy? Today this person is the enemy. Tomorrow the person who was the ally has become the enemy. People who we looked up to protect us are engaged in acts of atrocity against us. So the world order became much more fragmented. The amount of violence that was seen, the scale of violence increased so much that people lost that certainty. And therefore the modern narrative is fragmented and doesn't make that kind of complete sense. The reader has to put together the pieces and come up with their own answers. And the reader has to decide if there is good in this universe, where is that good situated? The hero is not necessarily a good person. The hero can sometimes be very troubling. And we see that in like Nabokov's Lolita, for example, or even more recently, The White Tiger, right? Books like that. The hero is very problematic. The story is told in a problematic way. Sometimes, like in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, it's told by so many narrators, we don't even understand how they relate to each other until the very end. And maybe not even then. Right? So that, I think, is a major difference. And if you look at art, you can see, and I'm not an art historian, so this is just from a layperson's point of view, where like the Renaissance paintings, everything was in its place. It was reflective of a moral universe. But if you look at something like Picasso's Guernica, right? Everything is exploded. You can't tell, what is this? You have to look at it 10 times. Is this an animal? Is this a woman? Like that. I think, modern literature is therefore sometimes difficult to read. People get frustrated. My students come to me and say, what is this? And then I have to say, the modern writer wants you to, the world has exploded. The only way to live in this world is for you as the reader to put the pieces back together in a way that makes sense to you.
Ma'am, my name is Dhruv, and at times still can't find the explicit relationship between anything that's happening and the dream. So what I'm trying to ask is, can anything like this actually give you inspiration to write, or can they give you some direction towards what you might be thinking of or what you can write?
Yes, I think definitely. Sometimes you get great story ideas and dreams, if you can remember them after you've woken up. But yes, I think so. And sometimes it's wonderful because you are kind of outside the dream, but obviously you are the creator of the dream. So on some level you've created that story, right? That story that you're dreaming, you have created it. Now you just have to take it and remember it and write it down, and of course add to it as necessary, because sometimes, dreams have that strange, lack of logic, right? Where some things will make sense and some things won't, and then you have to add in what the dream is lacking.
Have you ever got any kind of dream?
Yes, actually I have. It's very strange. I'm sure there's some kind of psychological explanation. When I was writing my novel, Queen of Dreams, in which one of the main characters is a dream interpreter, right? So if you are having certain dreams, let's say, that keep coming back, the dream that is like an obsession, right? So you can go to her and say, this is the dream I'm having, and she can analyze. She has the power to kind of analyze it and see if there's a real significance, all right? So as I was writing about the dreams of all these people who are coming to the dream interpreter, I started having all of these, very strange dreams. And I was like, oh, and now I need an interpreter to go to myself. But very interestingly, once I finished writing that novel, it was like that part of my brain shut off and I didn't have dreams like that anymore.
We'll take one final question, and since Chitra Di has always been a very good teacher, I wanted, and she's very amazed that now I have students. So let it be a student question. Okay, I'm sorry, Mukta, maybe after this.
Okay, two. We can take one student question
and one faculty question.
One faculty
one student question.
Of writing that piece of composition. So while writing, simultaneously you get an idea for writing a future composition also, and you preserve that, and how you possibly convert it into another piece of writing after this is completed.
Right, that does happen to me. A writer's notebook, which stays on my desk. So whenever I have a new idea, I'll write it in the writer's notebook. And I write down as many details about that idea that I have in my mind. And then it'll stay there, right? So if I think again about it and I have some more ideas, I'll continue writing. So I'm working on my main manuscript, but the notebook is there for any further ideas. And this is something I really do recommend to writers, because that way you don't lose your ideas. Otherwise, sometimes we have wonderful ideas and we know they'll make a good book, but by the time we come to them again, we've forgotten them. So a writer's notebook has been very helpful for me.
So whenever you're stuck, probably you can go back and...
Absolutely. Therefore, at the end of a project, I'm never stuck because I have 3 or 4 ideas and I go to them and then I try to feel them. Which one do I understand best? Which one can I feel most intensely in my imagination? And I'll choose that one to write. There's a hand way in the back. Is that a student?
Yes.
Okay.
And please, perhaps somebody who writes plays.
Ansari. I'm Dr. Shamda's student. And my question is, this talk is termed as a journey of a writer. But a journey cannot be made without some setbacks. There must have been in this journey some setbacks where you were cornered, where you had to face the wall. So how did you come out of it? What was the inspiration? How did you inspire yourself, motivate yourself? Can you share some of those incidents with us?
Sure. Well, backs. One of the repeated challenging moments is when you get writer's block, right? You're writing, you have this great idea, you get to this point in the story, and then you just don't know what's going to happen next. You have no clue about, you created this wonderful problem for your characters, but now you don't know how to get them out of there, right? So that's a major challenge, the writer's block. And I think, you just have to keep working your way through it. That's when, again, the writer's notebook is useful. You jot down ideas, you try one thing, you try another thing, you keep writing regularly. Sometimes when I get writer's block, I go and read the writers that have inspired me, and sometimes that will give me ideas to write. Or sometimes when I get really bad writer's block, I have a shelf in my study full of books that are really terrible, and then I read some of them, and then that gives me a lot of confidence. It's like, if those people could finish those books and get them published, hey, I can do it too.
We'll take one final question, and it's from Mukta.
Hi, I realize I got the last question, so I'm sorry to end on a low note. When I was in the States, I was talking to a woman who worked with women who had suffered domestic violence. And she said one of her big problems was women realized that they'd been violated, but they did not want others to think of them as battered women, quote unquote battered women. And that was one of her major challenges, is to get a woman to leave her husband, knowing full well that she had been violated. These women were mostly black and white women, and most of them had protective families. They went back to their mothers. Do we see this kind of shame at being a victim also among South Asian women?
Definitely. And that is something so ironic, isn't it? And that's something I've written about in some of the stories in arranged marriage. There's a story called First Snow, where a woman is a victim of a racist attack, but after the attack, in addition to feeling angry, she feels so ashamed that someone did that to her. It's as if it's her fault, when obviously it isn't. And I think victims in domestic violence situations often feel that way. And that's why it's important to have the counseling and to sit down with them and to work it through with them, to ask them questions like, but why do you feel like that? Do you see that something bad was done to you? You did not really cause it to happen. And I think, that's, you have to work through it psychologically. You have to be really, really patient with women in that situation, because it also comes out of a long history in communities, not just our communities, but often many communities where a woman who's a victim is made to feel ashamed. Oh, you must have done something, otherwise why would he have done something to you, right? And we have to kind of patiently and with love work through those old mental habits and get the woman to get back, stand on her own feet and start a new life. So, but thank you for that question. And thank you for all of your wonderful questions. I really enjoyed speaking to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chitra. May I now request Professor Jain to kindly give her a little memento from IIT Gandhinagar. Please, Professor Jain, please.
Last night I was asking her, are you a graduate of Presidency College? And the answer was yes. If you look at Presidency College, so many great people they have produced. I would like IIT Gandhinagar to produce some great, not only engineers and scientists, but also literature people. And she's our first PhD scholar in literature. So may I request Diti to do the honors, please. Thank you, Diti. Thank you very much, and we will go downstairs for a cup of tea, and she will be available for signing, book signing ceremony. Thank you.